Hi, my name is Jesse Cunningham, and I will be presenting our short story for the week, Two Words by Isabel Allende. Her first novel, The House of the Spirits, was published in 1982 when Allende was 40 years old and was greatly influenced by Gabriel Garcia Marquez's work. She began the novel as a letter to her grandfather after he had died at the age of 100, and she was trying to honor the stories that he told her while she was growing up. Like Marquez, she takes these fantastical stories and blends them into the history of Chile. She honors Neruda, Chile's most famous poet, and Allende, the great president who championed the people's cause before the military coup. In an interview, she tells the story of attending Neruda's funeral after the coup. Listen.
A month before the military coup, he was living in Isla Negra, and I went with the idea of interviewing him, but he didn't want that. He thought that I was the worst journalist in the country, that I could never be objective, that I lied all the time, and if it didn't have a story, I would make it up. But he loved the way I wrote, so he said, you should switch to literature, where all these defects are virtues. But a month and 11 days after this moment that I was with him, after we had the military coup was September 11th, 1973. 11 days later, Neruda died. And the funeral of Neruda was the first moment after the military had taken absolute control of the country and people were hiding and afraid. The Swedish ambassador went, and I just clung to his coat because I thought if they shoot somebody, they will not shoot the Swedish ambassador. So we walked between two rows of soldiers with machine guns. And then in the funeral at some point we were in silence, we were walking in silence. It was a gray day. Somebody shouted, Pablo Neruda, presente, everybody else responded. And then somebody shouted, Salvador Allende, and the crowd answered, presente. And that was the only moment in which we dared speak up somehow. And the funeral of the poet became also the funeral of the president.
Her next novel, Eva Luna, is a blended telling of the life of her family, political figures from both Chile and Venezuela, and the stories of an artist that she met after being exiled from Chile named Elsa Morales. Notice what drew her to Morales. This may or may not come in handy in your analysis of the story Two Words.
And I met there a young woman called Elsa Morales, who was a primitive artist. She would do these paintings that had no perspective and in bright colors, and she never wanted to learn anything about painting because it was her primitive art that was so striking and so beautiful. And talking with her, she told me her life. And many of the anecdotes in Eva Luna are from Elsa Morales' life.
She originally planned to have her second novel be another sort of literary journalism project, like The House of the Spirits, but something didn't feel right about it until she realized that she needed to either write fiction or an historical book, but she needed to stop trying to do both at the same time. This is what led to Eva Luna being such a mixture of different stories in order to create an ambiguity that freed her sense of literary expression and didn't tie her down to historical fact. Despite this, her work tends to shift back and forth between magic realism, which depicts the fantastical aspects of the real, and literature in the idealistic sense, which creates a romanticized view of how she sees the world. There can be a pretty fine line of distinction, so I will let Isabel explain the difference.
There is a difference between fantasy and magic realism. Fantasy, you never see a manifestation of fantasy in real life. For example, the invisibility cloak of Harry Potter. Magic realism would be the invisible Indians in the Amazon who really exist, and they paint their bodies in the colors of nature and work so swiftly and silently in nature that they can be 3 yards away and you don't see them. So that's magic realism.
As for her literary idealization, she says the following in an interview. I remember being very small and coming back from school running to hear the next chapter of the soap opera. Always very tragic stories and very sad stories too. I have that in Eva Luna. When Eva Luna is a child, she lives in the kitchen. She is a maid and she listens to the radio. That's the only contact she has with the world. And all the stories that she hears, she believes are true stories. I believed when I was a child that they were all true stories. So I thought that the world was full of very interesting people, and it was just me that was always bored. Everybody else was having these wonderful love affairs, except me. It is this tendency to idealize and romanticize the stories that she tells that causes some critics to question if we should still call some of her later works magic realism or not. It is also why critics question whether the happiness at the end of Eva Luna is meant to be taken as truth or just one more story that Eva creates to come to terms with her own world. We can see both of these aspects of her writing at work in the story Two Words. I suppose my first question for you is this. Does the existence of an idealized reality within her work negate the fantastical real that magic realism honors? Dr. Werner did suggest that the fiction becomes the real story when the story is absent, but what about when the story that is told no longer represents the feeling of what is, but instead the feeling of what might be? Do we still call that realistic? I don't know. What do you think? Two Words is the first story in a collection of short stories called The Stories of Eva Luna. Eva, the character from the previous novel, is lying in bed next to her husband Rolf, and she is telling him stories meant just for him. He tells her, "You think in words. For you, language is an inexhaustible thread you weave, as if life were created as you tell it. Tell me a story you have never told anyone before. Make it up for me." The novel then takes the form of 1001 Nights as she tells these stories to her husband Rolf as a form of pillow talk night after night. The Stories of Eva Luna showcases another shift in the writing style of Isabel Allende. Fictionalized, moralistic, and satirical stories, in the vein of 1001 Nights, told by a fictional character with the tendency for idealization. Two Words is in effect two different stories that each achieve a different purpose. There is a story of Belisa's growth as a writer that mirrors the real story of Isabel the author. Note that their names are a mirror as well. Belle, Isa, Belle. Then there is the story of her courtship of sorts with the Colonel. For the first section, it might be useful to look at Isabel's growth as a writer.
When I was very young and pregnant, there was a young woman who wanted to start a new magazine in Chile. Chile was a very conservative, patriarchal country, and she wanted a magazine that would sort of challenge the culture and the society, and especially the patriarchy. I mean, it was going to be a feminist, feminine magazine. In journalism, I learned all the skills that now I can use in fiction: how to research, how to conduct an interview, how to use language efficiently, how to really get to the emotion of the reader. Feminism was very new. I mean, no one was talking about it yet. And a way I thought of challenging men and all the prejudices and the stereotypes was to make fun of it. I would write a lot about husbands and a lot about, male chauvinism in general, all the ridiculous forms of male chauvinism. And sometimes I would write something serious. For example, I wrote an interview to a woman that was unfaithful. In Chile, it was, and I think it still is, sort of assumed that men could be unfaithful. It was part of being masculine, but not women. That was a real scandal. Even the Catholic Church got involved. And I had so much fun writing it.
In the short story, it says, "At the beginning, she offered her merchandise unaware that words could be written outside of newspapers." Belisa's exposure to writing begins with newspapers, and Isabel's with magazines. Belisa starts her growth by leaving her home behind, and Isabel is forced to do the same when she is exiled from Chile, which she credits for allowing her to further break free of the societal expectations placed upon her. This freed her ability to become a writer outside of television translations and magazine articles, where her feminist expression was often criticized.
So this book begins with a sentence that many people have said is an exaggeration. I say that I was a feminist since kindergarten. I was born in 1942. That means that next year I will be 80. I look good for my age, you have to admit. Yeah. Takes a lot of money. In 1942, in Chile, in a conservative, Catholic, patriarchal, Paleolithic family where I was born, and in a very socially conservative Catholic society, I don't think anybody had heard the word feminism. It was not in the narrative, let's say, let alone in my family. So why did I rebel against male authority since I was a little kid? My mother was abandoned by my father with 2 toddlers in diapers and a newborn baby that my father didn't meet because he left before the baby was born. There was no divorce in Chile until 2004. It was the last country in the world to get divorced. So my mother was stuck and dependent, completely dependent, economically, emotionally, in every way. And I saw my mother as a victim of this structure that, of course, I couldn't name. It was just that I felt that it was very unfair. I saw as unfair the situation of my mom and the maids that worked in the house. At the time, people had 2, 3 maids living in the house. In Chile, of course, that has changed. That's not the case anymore. And these women were mostly illiterate, very poor. They had very little free time, worked like slaves, and they had no voice, no presence. They were invisible, like my mother in a certain way was. So I developed this rage that I couldn't name. My mother thought that I had tapeworm, or I was colicky or something. So I was taken to doctors to see what was wrong with me, because with that character, I would never lure a husband. I was 5. So they had to worry about my future. That did not diminish when I was growing up. It grew. And when I was in my puberty and 2 little plums appeared here, I realized that I was really screwed. I was not going to have the kind of life that my brothers would have. I couldn't be like them, but I would try to have what they had. And so then the struggle to get all that started very young. And I couldn't name it. It was just random rage about everything. Everything made me angry. Until late in my life, in my early 20s, I found out that I was not a lunatic, that there was a movement out there called the Women's Movement, and that there were millions of other women thinking like me, and they were writing books, and they had an articulate language to express all this that I felt.
80-year-old Allende has filled more than 24 books with passionate and courageous characters. More than 74 million copies sold, translated into some 40 languages.
Your women are particularly strong. They take over your books.
Do you know any weak women, Rita?
I'm taking time now to emphasize Isabel's feminism because it has been called into question by some critics that see something else when they look at her writing. Look at the following excerpt from the article Isabel Allende and the Postmodern Literary Tradition, a reconsideration of the stories of Eva Luna. Most recently, David Buer has taken serious issue with several critics for their overemphasis on a supposed feminist agenda that has in fact disappeared in Allende's later fiction, these stories in particular. He states somewhat strongly that the critics' claims for her feminist standing are overstated at best and irresponsible posturing at worst, going on to state that it cheapens feminism to call Allende and others like her feminists when the evidence of their prose itself suggests something quite different, that is, female characters who long for a chivalric, romantic, mythical, and finally phallocentric past divorced from the realities of women's conflicts and struggles of the present. Okay. At first, that kind of upset me, but in the second part of 2 words, we might be seeing a little bit of what Buer is talking about. Does Belissa's desire for the colonel, a man in power, negate the feminist message? Certainly, I can see a desire for chivalry and romance in her work, but for the phallocentric past, it seems obvious that Isabel, the person, greatly rejects this reality. However, when we look at the literature and how it addresses the same notion, it might be useful to hear another interview response. When asked why her works do not contain any answers for the issues that she brings to attention, she says, because there are no answers, at least not any easy ones. If she idealizes the romance between them, but depicts a realistic stance regarding her place in society, what does that mean for her feminist message? Or perhaps this is all looking at the relationship between Belissa and the colonel as being too literal. There is a strong bond between writers and politicians in Latin America, in the same way that there was the bond between Neruda and Allende. Should we be looking at their romance as metaphorical? Is Belissa as Isabel, an expressed desire to be the next Neruda to the next Allende? Or is Belisa as Eva, an idealized version of her first relationship to the gorilla Huberto, her lover before Rolf? The only reason she left him was because he loved her the cause more than her, and that he could never respect her as an equal because she was a woman. So this sort of becomes an idealized reinvention of her first love, though that's certainly a choice, idealizing your first love while talking to your second love as pillow talk. But here we are. Okay, I have one final question for you. What do you make of the two words in the text? Is it as simple as some believe, that the two words are te amo, or I love you? Or is it that she gave him both his special word and her own special word, and those are the two words, and that's what created the bond between them? Remember, everyone else only received one word per person. That was their own special word. He does pay for two words, though, right? The peso for the 250 senses, which means that the speech that she gave him was technically free. However, I don't think the important idea is what the words themselves may be, but instead what they mean. Look at the following quotes. Each person received his or her own word, with the assurance that no one else would use it that way, in this universe or the beyond. And with her 3 remaining coins, she bought a dictionary. She poured over it from A to Z and then threw it into the sea because it was not her intention to defraud her customers with packaged words. So there seems to be some sort of indication that what's special about the words is their meaning or their use more than just what the word is itself. In other words, the signified, not the signifier. So to recap, these are my questions for you. Does the existence of an idealized reality within her work negate the fantastical real that magic realism honors? Does the story Two Words fail to be feminist in any way? Can you have a desire for chivalric romance and still have a feminist message? Is this all just an issue of Isabel being third wave in a world still shifting from second wave? The article is written in 2000. Remember, she created her own form of feminism, unguided by a policed movement that says what can or can't be feminism. And lastly, what do you make of the purpose of the 2 words in the story that are given to the Colonel? Are we meant to know what those words are? Do we need to know what those words are? Now, before you run off to the forums to discuss, I would like to leave you with one more clip of Isabel Allende showcasing her special brand of expression.
So, Isabel.
Thank you.
First of all, I never like to presume to speak for the TED community, but I would like to tell you that I have a feeling we can all agree that you are still charming, seductive, and sexy. Yes?
Oh, thank you.
Hands down.
No, it's makeup.
Now, would it be awkward if I asked you a follow-up question about your erotic
Oh,
fantasies?
go ahead. About what?
About your erotic fantasies. I was just
With
wondering
Antonio
if you
Banderas.
if you had anything more to share.
Well, one of them is that I place a naked Antonio Banderas on a Mexican tortilla. I slather him with guacamole and salsa. I roll him up and I eat him.